Welcome to Polish Insights on Global Affairs with PISM think tank, your go-to source for expert perspectives on the most pressing developments in world politics and security. I'm your host, Ada Janiszewska, and in today's episode, we're turning our attention to the United States. Joining us today is Paul Balawajder, American Affairs Analyst at PISM. Hello and welcome.
My pleasure to be here. Hello.
And we will try to unpack how the Iran war exposed cracks in Trump's Republican coalition. And time again during Donald Trump's campaign, he himself has said multiple times that he would get America out of endless war and put America's first. And then just a little over a year in office, America has opened several different military operations. We had Venezuela, we have Nigeria, Syria, unresolved situation with Ukraine, and now we have Iran. So what does it show?
It definitely shows that US foreign policy is at a very complex and tough moment in general. Definitely President Trump has, during his campaign, his 2024 campaign, promised not to engage in foreign wars, foreign entanglements, and he seems to be in a quagmire in Iran right now, something that supposedly people first expected would be similar to the 12-day war, which we had last year, where the US basically joined at the very end to decimate strategic targets regarding nuclear labs, which were in the mountains in Iran, using B-2 bombers, strategic bombers. However, we're now through already the third week of the war. It's fourth week. And the situation is looking very dire for President Trump.
And also the situation is vague because it transforms, and every single day we have new reports on what the situation looks like. So what does it show? Because I think that Donald Trump is also not very sure what will happen in the coming weeks, not to say months.
Definitely, there's also been a number of different communiques or statements done by President Trump. At first, they were winning. He was very quick to declare victory after the first few days, calling the Iranian military being decimated, being destroyed, the ballistic capabilities, the Navy famously. He also reiterated that another objective of the US was actually to target the nuclear labs, again, nuclear facilities, research and things of this sort. So, however, his stance has changed during the course of the whole conflict so far. We've heard different versions of what the US objectives are. And at this point, I am not certain really what President Trump wants. But definitely one thing that would help him is to just get out of it, because the longer this conflict persists, it will result in a major economic crisis, not only for the region, but also for Asia, for the US, and for us in Europe as well.
Speaking of this crisis, can we also say that we are now witnessing it? Because now we can see the surge in oil prices, for instance, and this change is very rapid.
Definitely, the problem is already visible because we've surpassed, currently, I think today was over $100 per barrel of oil, of crude oil. And it's only going to get worse the longer this conflict persists, as it was reported by the International Energy Agency. The situation will look quite terrible if it persists for, let's say, even a few months. The shock would be huge on the market. It would be very drastic for different economies around the world, but most notably also for Asia. We have to remember, through the Strait of Hormuz, it's basically 80% of what goes through there goes to Asia. It would be a huge impact, economic impact. But also domestically for the Americans, for Mr. Trump. And that would impact his chances of success in midterms. and of the Republican Party in the next presidential election.
And speaking of those midterms, because I think this is a very crucial moment for not only Donald Trump, but also for the whole Republican Party. And while many of Trump's fervent supporters back the current military operations, polls indicate, and I will give you some data, that 1 in 4 Republicans take the opposite view. And also recent polling shows that most Americans lack confidence in Trump's policies. And a Gallup poll in November, so just before the Iran war, showed that Trump's approval rating had dropped to just 36%. So can we say that this is a noticeable split among Trump's supporters?
We are definitely witnessing a split, that's for sure, but it's more complex than that. Just recently, there has been also a study done by Ipsos for the Quincy Institute, along with the American Conservative, and they looked exactly at how the MAGA base, the voters of President Trump from 2024, reacted to this war. And surprisingly, at least in the beginning, around 76%, I think, was actually supporting the president. And the number dropped just a little bit after the, let's say, passing of 3 weeks. Still, the majority of people who voted for Trump support him in this conflict with Iran. However, we are witnessing also a major, let's say, maybe not rebellion yet, but definitely a falling out within the MAGA base, within the administration, most noticeably with the resignation by Joe Kent, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He was working alongside Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, and that he made quite a statement on Twitter saying that basically the United States were dragged into this war by Israel and that there was no imminent threat to the United States, which was later being disputed by other chiefs of intelligence, mainly John Ratcliffe of CIA, whereas Tulsi Gabbard herself gave very vague statements during the hearing in the Senate on Wednesday, March 18th. So there's a couple of mixed signals coming there, but we are seeing a strain in the MAGA camp, for sure. Commentators like Tucker Carlson or Megyn Kelly are very anti-war, anti-Iran war, and they definitely seem that's their opinion on it. But like I told you just before, the MAGA base still stands behind President Trump. So while we see some certain key individuals kind of withdrawing their support, the base itself still holds. However, it could change with time.
And we will come back to this topic, but also speaking of this fallout among the Republican Party, in the context of responsibility for the decision to attack Iran, the U.S. president has recently named his own Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. Like, what does it mean? Because it shows that they're not communicating with each other.
I think the blame game slowly but surely is beginning. Yes, President Trump had some comments that would suggest he's kind of blaming Pete Hegseth, his Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, as he likes to call himself. And I think this will actually only continue as long as no immediate ceasefire, no deal would be reached. Because Trump will never take the blame to himself. He will put others to blame. That's for certain. And I think we may see more scapegoats for sure.
And you mentioned about those voices coming up front, criticizing the U.S. engagement and the conflict in the Middle East. And I am curious, like, how significant this criticism from influencers, media personalities, how significant can it be compared to Republicans? And are these critical voices, let's say, represent a broader grassroots sentiment, or maybe still a vocal minority?
It's quite complex. I would say it's both in a number of ways. We have to remember that social media and those influencers, all these commentators, along with, let's say, Joe Rogan, his podcast, it was viewed by millions of people during the 2024 campaign, and it definitely helped build President Trump's image just then. So things like that, I would say they definitely will impact the MAGA, the Republicans, the midterms, President Trump's approval ratings. And whereas still the majority, okay, they are supportive, but the more their wallets will be affected, the rising gasoline prices, but also in general, the cost of living crisis, which is going on in the US and is at the crux of a debate between Democrats and Republicans. I think more and more people who are kind of in between, the voters who sometimes swing between Republicans and Democrats, this group especially might be affected and they might flock to the Democrats, yes.
So we can say that economic concerns like rising oil prices could intensify these divisions?
Certainly. For Americans, really, they care about domestic affairs, first and foremost about their wallets, because still a big chunk of the populace, they're not following the war as intently as we are, for instance, I would say. But once they see the bills coming in and rising, it will become more and more of a problem for this administration.
But the real issue for the United States, I believe, is how that how the conflict in the Middle East will impact the upcoming midterm elections. Can the Republican Party maintain control over the White House?
It's very hard to say, but let's look at maybe some cases that we can actually see right now. J.D. Vance, he has withdrawn pretty much from the media for the most part of this war. He had some public statements. He did say a few things. However, from what we've learned so far, we can see that he most likely advised the president against the war, but he still supports President Trump in his decision. But this, I think, will also negatively affect his chances later on in 2028. But speaking just for the midterms themselves, which are coming up later this year in November, I think that Republicans, when I say Republicans, I don't only mean MAGA Republicans. We have to still remember there are other Republicans that have different views. They might not be happy with what's going on with Iran, and they might slowly rebel against this current policy, which will diminish the chances of winning in the midterms.
I believe that when it comes to voting, mobilization plays a key part here. And we can say that voters of the Democratic Party can now be more motivated to go to the polls and cast their vote. So what is your take on that? Do you think that this whole situation and maybe the fallout among the Republican Party can somehow mobilize the Democratic wing to really mobilize and go and vote and try to change something?
I do agree. I think that the longer the situation will be persisting, the bigger the chances that people will go out and vote in large numbers, because it's hard to remain, let's say, on the side on these issues. Just a few months before, we had the crisis regarding the use of ICE, of Immigration Enforcement Agency, how the agents operated in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. That was a very controversial affair that basically led to the resignation of Kristi Noem, the previous chief director of the Department of Homeland Security. Now we have Mark Wayne Mullen, the new director, and we can already see from his statements that he is trying to play for a different image, that they'll probably change some things, some tactics, and the pressure won't be as high as before, because it has backfired. This policy has backfired, and Americans in big numbers have protested against it. So definitely, I think Democrats will be more and more mobilized. The question still remains, who will be the candidate of the Democratic Party, I think.
Yes, because we still don't know who is the candidate.
Yes, we're still waiting for primaries, although we see some very potential candidates. Among them, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. who has been very active on social media and is using his, let's say, office and official Twitter handle even to
Yes.
constantly follow President Trump's foreign policy decisions and criticize him on that. But then again, we have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. She's very popular among young voters, more liberal
Especially
voters.
online, she's very popular
Yes.
nowadays, especially on platforms like TikTok.
Oh, yes, yes. She has a very large movement. And with basically Bernie Sanders most likely not contending, mostly due to his advanced age of 84 years, I think those voters might also flock to AOC and making her more of a potential candidate.
That would be very
So,
interesting,
Yes.
to say the least, for sure. Can we say that this whole war with Iran is becoming a defining test for Trump's political base?
It might be. It might be because so far he had some, let's say, quick victories with Venezuela, with a previous bombing during the 12 days war of Iran and Israel, where he just basically used precision strikes that didn't involve any injuries or deaths of the Americans. But now the US soldiers are dying. And like I said, I use the term quagmire specifically because it really seems to be a major problem. And Iran doesn't seem to back off without any kind of arrangement, any kind of deal. They will continue attacking ships through the Strait of Hormuz. And really, all they need to do is, from time to time, send a couple of drones. And that is enough to just scare the tankers, the ships, the companies from sending those ships through the strait. And this might really disrupt the whole chain.
And of course, the last question is this the most serious internal challenge for Donald Trump?
So far, I do think so that with Minneapolis maybe being the second major issue, the second major problem, his use of ICE agents, this might be his biggest mistake, especially on foreign policy terms, because allies are not happy with this decision. We will see a G7 ministerial summit of foreign affairs ministers and secretaries, along with Secretary Marco Rubio this Friday in France. And but so far, from what we've seen from the statements of US allies, no one really is happy. Also, the Gulf countries, because investment will probably go away in some portion later on, as it's not seemed as safe as it used to be.
So what happens next, I guess, will depend on whether Trump and other Republican leaders can reconcile, let's call it that way, these competing visions. And Paul Balawajder, American affairs analyst at PISM, was our guest today. Thank you so much for your time in this discussion.